Association, and Mr. Wilbur Forrest, assistant editor of the New York Herald Tribune and of the American Society of Newspaper Editors.
Mr. Forrest, having just returned around the world in the interests of freedom of the press, how do the prospects look to you?
Well, Mr. Chandler, if we are to judge by the reactions of editors of newspapers whom I have recently visited around the world, they are good. However, it is they which must decide whether they are willing to write into the peace treaties a pledge not to censor news at the source, not to control the press and radio and use them for political propaganda, and agree to permit a free flow of news across their borders. Many statesmen with whom I have talked have promised adherence to this program. Others have not, but you may be assured that when the peace treaties are being negotiated, there will be a concentrated demand for world press freedom by editors in most every country. The American Society of Newspaper Editors, with its membership representing every important newspaper in the United States, contends that complete understanding with any other sovereign power is dependent, among other considerations, on the freedom, the abundance, and the exchange of news among peoples. In other words, freedom of news is a vital element in any lasting peace. By control of the press, Hitler and his satellites blacked out the minds of the German people and led them blindly into ruinous war. And so did Mussolini in Italy. That must never happen anywhere.
Do you believe that something tangible can be worked out to this end?
It will not be easy, it can be done. There are some 50 nations on Earth differing widely in customs, religions, social, economic, and political standards. While it is unwise to expect too much, time has come when there must be an agreement on certain broad principles of human relations, which should apply to all peoples. Having seen 2 world wars in a single generation, world leaders are in agreement on the statement of President Truman.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
An attempt in this direction was made in the Atlantic Charter, formulated by President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, stressing the fundamental human rights of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want and fear. Among these 4 freedoms, Mr. Forrest, how do you rank in importance freedom of speech, including, of course, freedom of the press?
It's my contention that what we may call freedom of expression is really the most important of them all. This is because all other liberties depend upon it. There can be no freedom of worship without freedom of speech, and once a totalitarian regime blacks out freedom of expression, there obviously can be no freedom from fear, and certainly no freedom from want except on the formula of slavery. For instance, there was no physical want in pre-war Nazi Germany. Everyone had a job, but strictly as a serf or slave of the government.
That is very true, Mr. Forrest. The history of the world is replete with examples of how the loss of economic, political, and religious freedom invariably followed the loss of freedom of speech. Dictators first grasped for education, the printing presses, radio stations, and other media of free expression of opinion for very obvious reasons. They cannot stand opposition. Their program cannot be carried out until they dominate the sources of news, of speech, and thus the thoughts of men. Through the ages, man's struggle to call his soul his own has been largely the story of his fight for freedom of expression. When the Magna Carta was forced from the unwilling hands of King John, a great step forward was made. And when our pioneers came to America, freedom of speech was one of their cherished convictions. So they wrote into the Constitution these words: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Once this vital liberty is lost to a people, all others, such as trial by jury, freedom of worship, right to own property, right of assembly, and other sacred pillars of the temple of freedom, collapse like a house of cards.
It brings to mind a strong conviction I have long held, that the right to own property is the keystone of all these liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Why? We know that the hand that clothes and feeds the child reserves the right to spank it. And when a government owns or controls the printing presses and the houses of worship, it has never failed to dictate how and when they should be used. Under our system of private enterprise, newspapers are dependent for their success on the goodwill of the people. Once this is lost, their revenues decline and they cannot long continue. Our press is independent of government, which is the people's great protection. And so we see that the right of private ownership of property is vital to freedom of speech and also worship. This whole subject of freedom of speech is of vital importance to the future peace of the world, and our country, where it has found its highest expression, must assume world leadership, for I can see little prospect of lasting peace among peoples who are denied this fundamental human right.
Well, I quite agree with you. In little more than a decade, the Nazi totalitarian regime gained complete domination of education, the press, radio transmission, and freedom of expression of all kinds, and therefore the thinking of an entire people. News from outside sources was completely blacked out, or worse, distorted to meet the ends of Nazi propaganda. In short, every process of thought of the German people was completely controlled and harnessed behind the most brutal, fiendish, and fantastic policies in the history of mankind. In the tragic pattern of this Nazi horror and its satellite allies, there is a tremendous lesson for every country on earth. It is simply this: protect your freedom of speech and freedom of the press at all costs, for all your other liberties depend upon it.